A warning. This episode contains graphic descriptions of crime scenes, some of which involve the deaths of children and a baby.
A LiSTNR production.
On October the 12th, 2002, bombs tore through two crowded bars in Bali, killing 202 people, including 88 Australians. In the aftermath, forensic experts from Australia were sent to help identify the victims and bring them home. Dr. Pamela Craig was one of them. As a forensic odontologist, she spent days in the mortuary and then the reconciliation room, where she worked matching dental records to the remains of those lost. Often, she was identifying victims burned beyond recognition. But that wasn't the only time she was called to help after a tragedy. In early 2005, she joined a small contingent of Australian forensic scientists who travelled to Thailand to help identify victims of the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami. Then, in 2009, she was part of the forensic response to the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, where over 170 people lost their lives. Today, Pam takes us inside these investigations. She will explain how forensic odontology brings answers to families and what it takes to do this kind of work when the stakes are so high. My name's Liz Porter. I'm a journalist, true crime author, and forensic science obsessive. I've spent my career uncovering how forensic science cracks the toughest cases, writing 3 books on the subject and earning a PhD in the history of the Victoria Police Forensic Science Lab. Join me as I sit down with the world's top forensic experts and discover how forensic science is convicting the guilty and exonerating the innocent.
I was at work and I got a phone call from the Australian Federal Police, and they said that there'd been a bombing and that there was going to be a forensic team going up, and the organisation of this whole crime scene was devolving on the Australian Federal Police. It was beyond the Indonesians' capabilities to do it, apparently, or they thought so. So it was going to be run by the Australian Federal Police. So the police gathered together everybody in Australia with forensic expertise, and there's only about 15, 20 people. There are very few people who do this. And off we went to Canberra to get sworn in as federal police officers. We were flown up to Denpasar and then to Bali and stayed at the Katika Plaza Hotel. Now, you have to remember, when we got there, it was still a crime scene. They hadn't caught the perpetrators. There were armed soldiers all around the perimeter of the hotel. We couldn't get out. We couldn't go anywhere. We were stuck in the place. We had to have rooms on the 2nd floor. No 2 rooms adjoining. There had to be a gap, and we had to change rooms every 2 days. Any letters that we sent off, or phone calls I should say, that we sent off to our nearest and dearest were censored and vetted by the Australian Federal Police. So all I could do was go into the shower, run the shower so that they couldn't hear, and call my husband. But Bali there were about 200 people that were involved, and we had a lot of experts there. They were not only forensic odontologists, there were fingerprint experts, there were anatomists, there were forensic anthropologists, all sorts of people there. And we worked in the Denpasar hospital, which had a sort of morgue arrangement, but only to fit 2 bodies. We had so many. And they were all in body bags on the lawn in the courtyard of the hospital. And every day, a little group of school children would come along with aprons and little red crosses on their aprons and cover all the body bags with ice. You would think it would be a pretty disgusting scene, but it wasn't. It was absolutely fantastic. It was clean as a whistle, didn't smell anything. But it was a terrible scene because it was deliberate. Things like the bushfires and the tsunami and so forth, they're natural phenomena. And you think, all right, well, that's life on this planet. But this was a deliberate slaughtering of all those kids who were in the bars at the time, which made it very sad.
What was your initial reaction when you were called and asked to go to Bali? Because this was your first, I think...
That was the first DVI, but I'd done a lot of work before that. A DVI, disaster victim identification, is defined as a situation in which a large number of people die at the same spot or on the same occasion. I thought, look, it's not going to be easy. I'm leaving my husband and my children. I'll be away in a war-torn area. But it's my job. I've been trained to do this, and I have a responsibility to the community to do the best I can to identify these people.
And you were taken, I gather, at least once to have a look at the actual site of the bomb explosion.
We were taken to the sites, but by that stage a lot of it had been cleared up. There were crime scene barriers across it and everything. There wasn't a lot to see apart from wreckage. The Balinese had come and taken all the Balinese people with them. We didn't have to identify any of them because they have a different culture. They don't go into a lot of effort to identify their dead, whereas we do. We can, and we can afford it. That's the other thing.
Can you walk us through what your actual working day was like in the mortuary and also in the reconciliation room? Because I gather your work was split over sort of two workplaces.
It was. Well, there are two aspects to it. First of all, you have to identify the bodies. And to do that, well, we looked at their teeth. Other people were looking at other things, fingerprints and so forth. When you've done your examination, it goes into a sheet, a pink sheet, which is an Interpol standardised post-mortem sheet. And ours says dental. The others say fingerprints, the others say clothing, any height, weight, etc., etc. But ours said dental. So you put all your findings onto this pink sheet. And that goes back to the reconciliation room. And in the reconciliation room in Bali, anyway, because we're doing all this by hand in Bali, we had a big long table. And on one side were all the ante-mortem records of the males and all the ante-mortem records of the females on the other side, and unknown, because there are lots of people blown to smithereens, in the middle.
Just to clarify, ante-mortem is, of course, before death.
Yes, so that before the ante-mortem records are on exactly the same sheet, except it's yellow. The ante-mortem records obtained for people who are reported as missing. And so the police will go along and they'll get everything they can from that person. They'll go to the house, they'll get photographs, they'll get the name of the dentist, they'll get fingerprints or footprints. They're good at footprints too. Off the bathroom, they'll get DNA off a toothbrush. And so they will have a complete idea of what this person was like. So our job was to match them. So you're matching things. And we would have the help of radiographs that were taken of the people by their dentist, their whole dental record, any fillings they might have had, any orthodontic treatment they might have had. And we compare that with radiographs that we've taken in the mortuary, and we can get a match, hopefully. So in Bali, we just trawled around. We'd have our little post-mortem sheet and we would trawl around looking to see if we could find an ante-mortem match. Sometimes it was easy, sometimes it was very hard.
Are there any particular cases that have stayed with you from that experience?
There was one particular one. It was right at the end, just before I was about to go, because we were on rotation. And I found the front of an upper jaw. Wouldn't have been more than about 7 or 8 centimetres square. There had been 2 central incisors in there, but they'd blown out. But what I did notice was that the distance between those 2 incisors was unusual. Mostly they stay pretty well straight up. But these were splayed out quite a long way, and I thought, that's not normal. So I took a radiograph, and sure enough, there was a great big hole in the middle. And I thought, that teenager must have had an extra tooth in the middle of their jaw, which is not unusual. It's called a mesiodens. And that was extracted at some stage. So I thought, how can I get hold of this? And I had various colleagues in Australia, and a colleague in Perth said, look, I think this belonged to somebody who was treated by an oral surgeon friend of mine. I'll see if he's got the x-ray. And he rang this bloke, and he did. So that was flown up on the next plane, and the two x-rays matched perfectly. Now, that was probably a complete fluke that it did. But that enabled that family at least have something of their poor child back.
At this stage, when you're working in both the mortuary and the reconciliation room, the terrorists were still at large. So how did that feel?
Well, at 6:30 every morning, the ASIO spooks would come along into the reception area of the Katika Plaza Hotel and tell us how dangerous it was, how our lives were at risk, how we weren't to talk to anybody, how every day the bus would go in a different direction to the hospital. So we'd either go the tip route, the village route, the swamp route. So it was quite unnerving in a way. But we're all there together. We could swim in the pool. We could go and have a beer and a drink and a swim after we'd finished work. It wasn't that bad. And anyway, we're all tough. If you're not tough, you don't last. There was one bloke from Sydney who didn't last. He left after 3 days because he couldn't cope. You've got to have a certain temperament to do this.
And how would you describe that temperament?
The ability to distance oneself and to think, I am doing a job for a person or people that they regard as extremely important and nobody else can do it. So that's the way I think about it all.
And some of these young people whose remains you were examining might not have been much older than your own children.
They weren't. They weren't. And it's distressing in a way. You just got to overcome that. You have to say, I'm not even going to think. It was easier to do that because we didn't have a lot of photographs. I wasn't at the stage where I was in Thailand of having two computer screens with the antemortem remains and the photograph of the child and having to put one on top of the other. That was distressing, and I did that for 10 months.
So in total, 60% of victims were identified through dental analysis. What makes odontology such a powerful tool in forensic identification?
Teeth are like fingerprints. There are no teeth that are absolutely identical. Now, how identical you want them to be differs depending on what you're trying to do. If you're looking at a murder case or something like that, the idea is that you have to be absolutely perfect in your identification because unless you've got the right victim, you haven't got a court case. And so you have to have a much higher standard of evidence. If it's a missing person and you've got some antemortem stuff, it's much easier. You can say, look, it's probable that since that dental record was made by the dentist, this person has had perhaps a couple of extra fillings, or they've been to the orthodontist and they've had their teeth moved a little bit. That's sufficient, but not if somebody's standing up for murder.
Pam, you're also involved in the international forensic response to the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, which hit Thailand, Malaysia and other areas across Asia. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, the area that we were involved in really was around Phuket, which is a tourist area. And because it's a tourist area, of course, there were plenty of tourists at that time. Very few of them were Australian. I think there were only 6 or 8 Australians. But the hotels were full of Europeans, Northern Europeans escaping the winter. So the Australian Federal Police was given control of the DVI because they had had the experience in Bali and the Thais had not done this. So they sent us all over there, but we were not alone this time. We went over, but also forensic odontologists from Europe, which made for an interesting and sometimes rather difficult working situation. They hated the fact the Australian Federal Police were running it, and they were under instructions to identify people of their own nationality only, whereas the Australian Federal Police quite rightly said, you are there to make an identification. It doesn't matter which country the person came from. It made life a little bit difficult. The system was much more complex at that stage because there were more people. There were 2,500 people. And so the whole thing was run by computer, very different from Bali. So there were 3 areas that you would work in. And one was entering the data. So you'd enter all the ante-mortem data onto this big computer. And there would have been about 20 people or so doing that. And then there were people out at the mortuary in Cowlack doing all the examinations. And then there was the reconciliation area. And that was highly sought after because they all wanted to be in reconciliation to get their own citizens back to Denmark or Sweden or wherever they came from. I got a spot on the reconciliation because I'm good at Photoshop, and not many of the other ones were. And so I got this spot, one of about 6 reconciliation spots for the whole thing. And was I unpopular? Oh, they all hated me because here I was, an Australian. I had no vested interest in finding any particular identification or any particular nationality. I was there just to do a job. And I spent, apart from the week in Cowlack, where I got sick, it was too hot. I'm not very good in the heat.
And Cowlack, just to clarify, that was the actual scene?
It was a monastery near the actual scene. The actual scene was huge. It took 20 minutes to drive through it. All these flattened hotels and boats right up against the sides of the hills that had been completely washed up. So it was a converted monastery in which they'd assembled a temporary mortuary. And they'd also brought in a whole lot of refrigerated containers and things. It wasn't very pleasant. My job was to make sure that everything had been done properly in the mortuary, and I was ticking off everything had been done. And then I would yell, "Taxi!" And 2 blokes would come along, grab the stretcher and take it back to the refrigerated trucks. It was a terrible job. So anyway, I didn't do that for very long. I got into reconciliation, and that's when it became really emotionally hard because you're looking at the picture of the smiling children on holidays, and then you're looking at the remains, and you're superimposing one upon the other. And I had to do a lot of those, lots and lots of them. Some you could do without worrying about the photographs. You just look at the ante-mortem dental records and the post-mortem dental records, and you could extrapolate from that who the person was. But sometimes it was only photographs. There were a lot of cowboys in that place too. There were people who would take out the front teeth of the victims. These are the dead ones. Take out the front teeth in order to send them to China to do DNA. If they take the front teeth, what am I going to do? I can't work with anything then.
When you say people, they were forensic people?
Forensic odontologists from Europe.
From Europe, because they wanted to give their compatriots that kind of certainty.
Look, I don't know. I think that was the way they worked. They took out teeth, sent them for DNA, didn't bother doing anything else. And so, of course, it made my life very, very difficult.
Pam, you were also involved in the local forensic response to the Victorian Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. How did that compare either to Bali or to the 2004 tsunami effort?
It was very different. Each one of those DVIs was a very, very different scenario. One was an injury, one was a drowning, and one was a fire. So you'll get remains in a very, very different way under those three circumstances. The bushfires were the most difficult because a lot of situations existed in which there was what's called commingling. I still find the bushfires very upsetting, unlike the others. I find this upsetting. People would huddle together in their house with their animals. So I had to go up to our comparative dental anatomy museum, take out a whole lot of skulls, x-ray all these animal skulls, sheep and dogs and cats and things like this, so that when the body bag went through the x-ray scanner, which it did, then people could point out, oh yes, that's the cat, that's the dog, they're the children, etc. So they're all together. And that made it very difficult. And the other thing it was, depending on the temperature of the fire, was how much was left. In some cases, the fires were so hot that you couldn't touch the teeth. You had to spray them all with hairspray we used, just to hold everything together enough so that you could actually identify it as a tooth. It was very, very difficult. But one good thing about it, if there was anything good, which there wasn't, was that all the people pretty well had been to the dentist, and none of the dental surgeries have been burnt down. Now, had they been burnt down, we would have been in big, big trouble.
Were there any other scientific lessons from this exercise?
The idea that you scoop and run, which occurs in car accidents and things, you just gather what's there and take it to where you can actually examine it properly. That was developed. So that the police didn't go out to the crime scenes and rummage around. They would look for a spot where it was likely that there were bodies and things there. They would gather everything together in a body bag and transport it back to the VIFM. And once they were at the mortuary, it would go through the CT scanner before being opened by anybody. And that was a development, I think, that occurred at the bushfires and was good.
So before that, would crime scene personnel attempt to figure out at the scene what might be useful and what might not be useful?
Well, they do, and they try, but sometimes they don't get it right. And they can disturb the scene so much that you don't know what's going on.
We've been talking about these large-scale cases that you've worked on, but there are also cases involving individuals that have very much stayed in your memory. And one back in 1992 involved the finding of a baby's bones.
Yes, a couple of boys were fishing for yabbies in a dam. And as they were fishing for yabbies, they fished out a plastic bag that contained some sort of stuff, which they showed to their parents, and the parents recognised the fact that there were some little bones in there. And originally that they thought that it might have been the remains of a roast chook or something like that, because they're about the same size. But the parents, I think, must have had some idea that they were more important than that. So off they went to the police, and the bones eventually found their way up into our department at the university. And we proceeded to clean them up and lay them out. Now, there was a wonderful old anatomist from Hungary called Feri Koza who wrote a book about bone lengths and fetal development, really from conception up until birth. And it was based on a series of abortions and miscarriages and things that had taken place in Budapest during the Soviet era. You couldn't do that these days, so it's a very valuable resource. So we measured the bones and we compared them with Feri Koza's book and determined that the baby was actually 10 months gestation. So the next thing we had to do was find out whether the baby had actually breathed. Now, to do that, it's quite complicated. You have to take out a tooth, one of the developing teeth. Now, what happens when teeth are developing is that the enamel rods grow at a certain rate every day. And they grow in terms of oxygen saturation. So if the oxygen saturation is lower, they will grow a little bit shorter. If the oxygen saturation suddenly changes so that it's a lot higher, then they're going to change their direction and they're going to change to grow more. And this is called the neonatal line in the enamel. And this will tell us whether the child's actually breathed. So we did that and we found that, yes, there was a neonatal line and the child had breathed. Well, after that, the bones and everything else went back to the VIFM. We never heard another word about it. But often that's the case. We're never told the results of our investigation.
You were presented with this collection of bones, but you and a colleague actually reconstructed the skeleton, didn't you?
Well, you don't reconstruct the skeleton so much as you lay it out. I mean, if you've looked at any programs on paleontology, for instance, they will lay the skeleton out in a certain way so that it displays all the bones and all the structures and things, but they're not actually in a sort of round way. They're not three-dimensional, they're just laid flat. So that's what we did.
You were also involved in solving another long-term mystery involving the body of a man who was found inside a Melbourne beachside bathing box.
Yes, he'd obviously had some sort of emotional crisis. He'd painted himself blue with Dulux paint and hung himself in this bathing box. And he was found by two little boys playing around the bathing box who noticed a funny smell. So the police arrived, of course, and eventually his head came back to us. And we cleaned it up, and I won't go into the details. Looked at it and worked out that he was probably in his 30s. As I said, it's more difficult to age people when they're older. He didn't have a filling in his head, so we couldn't do anything dental, but we could do some anthropological findings. He'd had a pretty rough life. He'd had a depressed zygomatic arch, his cheekbone, a broken nose, a broken jawbone, and these had all healed. But his face would have been quite crooked. So we couldn't do much else about that. Nobody had a clue who he was. Nobody had been reported missing. And so we decided that we would do a reconstruction of the soft tissues. And this is a scientific way of doing this, and it's done a lot around the world. But Ron Taylor, one of the technicians in our university, was able to do this and produced this facsimile of this head, which was published in the newspapers. Nothing happened. Nothing happened again. And time went on, and I forgot about the blue man, and they got a new missing persons woman in the police force. Well, she was a terrier. I can't remember her name, unfortunately. She was wonderful. And every now and then she'd ring me up and she said, "I think I've got a match for your blue man." And I'd say, "Oh, goody, we'll get out the photographs and everything else and try again." It took, I think, 9 years before he was finally identified. And he wasn't identified by anything that I'd done at all. They'd buried him in Springvale and they dug him up and did a DNA test because his parents had been in Melbourne at the time looking for him, and nobody had reported anything. And all that time and effort wasted.
So he'd never been reported as a missing person at the time?
No, at the time, no. And they eventually got the parents to donate some DNA and they identified him with that. He was Norwegian and he jumped ship.
Thanks so much, Pam. It's been extraordinarily interesting.
Good, it's my pleasure, Liz. Lovely to be with you.
Crime Insiders Forensics is hosted by me, Liz Porter. It's produced by Holly Mitchell, Dan Mullins and Jade Murray. Sound design is by Link Kelly. This podcast is produced on Wurundjeri and Gadigal lands. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations listeners.